Sneezing is one of those ordinary things I had experienced thousands of times without ever questioning it. Sometimes it happened while cleaning a dusty room. Sometimes it was the sharp smell of pepper. Other times it came with seasonal allergies, a runny nose, or the beginning of a cold. The triggers seemed completely unrelated. Dust is a physical particle. Pepper contains chemicals that irritate the nose. Pollen can activate an allergic immune response. A respiratory infection causes inflammation inside the nasal passages. Yet somehow, all of them can produce the same unmistakable reaction. A sudden intake of breath. A moment when the body seems to pause. Then an explosive burst of air that happens so quickly it feels almost impossible to stop. That was the part one had never considered. How could such different things produce exactly the same coordinated reflex? Why would the nervous system respond to pollen in the same way it responds to dust, pepper, smoke, or an infection? Was the body identifying each trigger separately and choosing the same response every time? Or did all these different triggers eventually enter one shared biological pathway? Once I started looking into the science of sneezing, I discovered that researchers had been investigating the sensory nerves, brainstem circuits, and coordinated muscle activity behind this familiar reflex. And the scientific story began with a surprisingly simple question. What happens inside the nose the moment a sneeze begins? Scientists already knew that sneezing was a protective reflex. They knew it helped remove material from the upper airway by forcing air rapidly through the nose and mouth. They also knew that many different things could trigger it. People sneeze because of pollen, dust, smoke, pepper, strong chemical odors, and respiratory infections. The list of triggers seemed surprisingly long. But simply knowing what caused people to sneeze didn't answer the more interesting scientific question. If these triggers were so different from one another, how could they all produce exactly the same reflex? Think about it for a moment. A grain of dust is a tiny physical particle. Pollen can trigger an immune response. A virus causes inflammation as it infects cells lining the nose. Pepper contains chemical compounds that directly irritate tissues. These are completely different biological situations. Yet within seconds they can all produce the same sequence of events. A deep breath, a brief pause, and an explosive sneeze. Scientists wondered whether the body recognized each trigger separately and then independently decided to sneeze every time. Or was something else happening? Could these different threats all be entering a single shared defensive pathway before the brain even decided to trigger the reflex? That question shifted the investigation away from the sneeze itself and toward the first moments that happen inside the nose. Researchers began asking a much more precise question. What is the very first biological event that every sneeze has in common, regardless of what triggered it? That question would lead scientists to the sensory nerve endings hidden within the lining of the nasal cavity, where every sneeze, whether caused by dust, pollen, pepper, or a virus, begins its journey. To answer that question, scientists began investigating what happens at the exact moment something enters the nose. Rather than studying only one trigger, researchers examined many of them. They looked at allergens such as pollen, respiratory viruses, airborne dust, smoke, and chemical irritants like the compounds found in pepper. Although these triggers affect the body in different ways, they all have one thing in common. They come into contact with the delicate lining of the nasal cavity. This lining isn't simply a passive surface. Embedded within it are thousands of specialized sensory nerve endings that constantly monitor the air we breathe. Their job is to detect anything that could potentially threaten or irritate the tissues of the upper airway. As scientists compared these different triggers, an important pattern emerged. It didn't matter whether the irritation came from a microscopic dust particle, an inflammatory response caused by a virus, or chemicals released from pepper. Before a sneeze could happen, each of these triggers activated the same sensory nerve endings within the nasal lining. In other words, although the triggers are completely different, every sneeze begins by activating the same biological alarm system. That was the first major clue. The body wasn't creating a completely different pathway for every possible threat. Very different irritants were converging at the same starting point before the reflex had even begun. But discovering where every sneeze starts only raised another question. Once those sensory nerves detect a potential threat, how does that warning travel from the nose to the brain? Finding the common starting point answered one part of the mystery, but it immediately created another. Detecting an irritant inside the nose isn't enough to produce a sneeze. Somehow, that information has to be delivered to the brain. To understand how this happens, researchers traced the pathway followed by the sensory signals after the nerve endings inside the nasal lining were activated. They discovered that these warning signals travel through branches of the trigeminal nerve, the largest sensory nerve of the face. This nerve continuously carries information from the nose, eyes, mouth, and much of the face to the brain. Whether the irritation comes from pollen, dust, pepper, smoke, or another trigger, the first part of the journey is remarkably similar. The activated sensory receptors generate electrical signals that travel along trigeminal nerve fibers toward the brainstem. In other words, although the triggers themselves are very different, they all send their warning through the same sensory highway. That was another important discovery. The nervous system doesn't need separate communication routes for every possible irritant. Instead, many different threats are funneled into one shared neural pathway, allowing the brain to receive the information quickly and consistently. But carrying a warning to the brain doesn't automatically produce a sneeze. The brain still has to decide what to do with that information. Researchers now wanted to answer the next question. Where does the brain receive this signal and transform it into one of the fastest protective reflexes in the human body? Following the trigeminal nerve brought scientists to the next stage of the investigation. If every sneeze signal reaches the brain through the same sensory pathway, where does the brain actually organize the response? Researchers studying both animal models and human neurological disorders found that the incoming signals converge within a specialized network of neurons in the brainstem, particularly in the medulla. Rather than identifying a single sneeze center, the evidence points to a coordinated brainstem sneeze network that receives sensory information and orchestrates the reflex. This distinction is important. The brain isn't analyzing whether the irritation came from pollen, pepper, dust, or a virus before building a unique response for each one. Instead, once the incoming sensory information reaches this brainstem network, the nervous system activates the same protective program, regardless of what originally triggered the warning. In other words, the brain doesn't have one sneeze for allergies, another for pepper, and another for infections. It uses one shared defensive circuit that can respond to many different kinds of irritation. This makes the system both fast and efficient. The body doesn't waste valuable time identifying every possible threat before acting. If the tissues lining the upper airway are being irritated strongly enough, the brainstem can rapidly initiate the same protective reflex. But this discovery immediately raised another question. Activating a defensive circuit is one thing. A sneeze, however, is an incredibly complex movement involving the lungs, diaphragm, throat, chest, soft palate, tongue, and facial muscles, all occurring within a fraction of a second. So researchers asked the next logical question. How does one small signal arriving in the brainstem coordinate an entire body-wide motor program so quickly and so precisely? Identifying the brainstem sneeze network explained where the reflex was organized. But it still didn't explain how a sneeze actually happens. A sneeze isn't a single muscle contracting. It's one of the fastest coordinated motor sequences the human body can produce. To understand how this reflex unfolds, scientists analyzed the pattern of muscle activity during sneezing. They measured the timing of breathing, monitored respiratory muscles, and examined how different structures of the upper airway work together. What they discovered was a remarkably organized sequence. The reflex doesn't begin with an explosive burst of air. It begins with a deep inhalation. That first breath fills the lungs with air, providing the volume needed for what comes next. Almost immediately afterward, the glottis, the opening between the vocal cords, closes. With the airway temporarily sealed, the diaphragm and powerful muscles of the chest contract, rapidly increasing pressure inside the lungs and chest cavity. For a brief moment, that pressure is trapped. Then, at precisely the right instant, the glottis suddenly opens. The compressed air is released at high speed through the nose and mouth, carrying mucus, droplets, and irritating particles away from the upper airway. In other words, a sneeze isn't one explosive movement. It's a carefully timed sequence of events that builds pressure first, then releases it in a fraction of a second. Scientists realized that every step in this sequence had to occur in exactly the right order. If the breath wasn't taken first, there wouldn't be enough air to generate a forceful expulsion. If the airway didn't close briefly, pressure couldn't build. And if dozens of muscles didn't contract with precise timing, the reflex would lose much of its effectiveness. That led to the next question. How can so many different muscles, spread across the chest, throat, face, and airway, all contract with such extraordinary precision in less than a second? As scientists continued studying the sneeze reflex, they realized something remarkable. The explosive release of air is only the final moment of a much larger operation. To produce an effective sneeze, the brainstem has to coordinate dozens of muscles almost simultaneously. The diaphragm, muscles between the ribs, abdominal muscles, muscles of the larynx, the soft palate, the throat, and muscles controlling the nose and mouth all have to work together in a precise sequence. If even one part of that sequence is poorly timed, the force of the sneeze is reduced. Researchers discovered that this coordination happens automatically. Once the brainstem sneeze network is activated, it sends signals through multiple motor pathways at nearly the same time, ensuring that every muscle performs its role at exactly the right moment. The diaphragm provides the initial volume of air. The chest and abdominal muscles generate pressure. The larynx controls when that pressure is released. The muscles of the upper airway direct the airflow through the nose and mouth. Each structure performs a different task, yet together they function as one integrated defensive system. In other words, a sneeze isn't your nose reacting. It's your brain coordinating a whole-body motor program designed to rapidly remove potentially harmful material from the upper airway. This level of coordination is one reason sneezing feels impossible to stop once it has begun. By the time you're consciously aware that a sneeze is coming, much of the motor program has already been organized by the brainstem. The body has shifted from detecting a possible threat to executing a protective response. That brought scientists to one final question. Why would evolution preserve one powerful reflex that can respond to so many different kinds of threats instead of creating separate defenses for each one? By this point, scientists had connected the major pieces of the puzzle. Very different irritants all activate sensory nerve endings inside the nose. Those warning signals travel through the trigeminal nerve to a brainstem network that coordinates the sneeze reflex. But one question still remained. Why would the body use the same reflex for so many different threats? The answer became clearer when researchers looked beyond the triggers themselves and focused on what they all have in common. Dust, pollen, smoke, viruses, and chemical irritants are very different, but each has the potential to disturb the delicate tissues lining the upper airway. From the nervous system's perspective, the exact identity of the trigger isn't the first priority. What matters is that the airway has been irritated strongly enough to require a rapid protective response. In other words, the nervous system isn't asking, is this pollen? Is this pepper? Is this a virus? Its first question is much simpler. Is the upper airway being threatened? If the answer is yes, the same defensive circuit is activated. This strategy allows the body to respond immediately instead of delaying the response while identifying every possible irritant. Different threats may require different immune responses later, but the sneeze provides an immediate mechanical defense that helps clear the upper airway before those slower systems take over. The investigation began with a simple question about why so many different things make us sneeze. It revealed something much broader. Sometimes the most efficient biological solution isn't creating many different reflexes. It's building one reliable reflex that can protect us from many different kinds of threats. When I started looking into this question, I assumed the answer would be about sneezing itself. Instead, it revealed something much bigger about how the nervous system solves problems. At first, it seems inefficient that dust, pepper, pollen, smoke, and even viruses can all produce exactly the same response. But the science shows the opposite. The body isn't trying to identify every possible irritant before it reacts. It first asks a much more important question. Is the airway being threatened? If the answer is yes, a protective program begins immediately. Only later do other systems, like the immune system, determine exactly what caused the irritation and how to deal with it over the longer term. This investigation isn't really about sneezing. It's about a design principle found throughout the human body. Evolution often doesn't create a new solution for every new problem. It builds one dependable solution that can handle many different situations. The sneeze is one example of that principle. Behind what feels like a simple common reflex is a highly organized neural circuit that protects one of our most important connections with the outside world, our airway. It becomes another reminder that what looks like a simple reaction that we all have experienced many times is the product of extraordinary biological design.